The classroom was the most dangerous battlefield of the Cold War, a place where the soul of a nation was either forged in the fire of critical thought or crushed into a shapeless tool of state service, while the United States was building an educational empire based on the radical idea of individual potential, where the student was encouraged to challenge the teacher, debate the Constitution, and view the world as an open book of possibilities. The American 1980 school was a chaotic, vibrant laboratory of the mind, where the goal was to create a citizen who could think for themselves. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet school was an ideological factory line designed to produce new Soviet men, obedient, uniform, and intellectually sterilized units who didn't ask why, but only how fast they could serve the party. This fundamental clash between the questioning mind of the West and the programmed brain of the East was the true reason the USSR was doomed to fail. Because a nation that fears its own children's thoughts is a nation that has already lost the future. And if you watch this entire video, you will see the terrifying reality of how the Soviet state used psychological conditioning and military drills to turn children into soldiers of an ideology that would eventually betray them. The contrast in the philosophy of history and the weaponization of the past revealed a gap between truth and mythology that was impossible to bridge. In the US, history was a messy, often self-critical subject, where students were taught about the flaws of their own system, from slavery to the Great Depression, encouraged to analyze the mistakes of the past so they wouldn't repeat them. The American classroom was a place of pluralistic truth, where different textbooks and different voices competed for the students' understanding. In the USSR, history was a fairy tale written by the KGB, a carefully curated narrative where the Communist Party was the infallible hero of time and every failure was blamed on Western saboteurs or internal traitors. Soviet children weren't taught history. They were taught hagiography, a religious-like devotion to a distorted past that erased millions of victims and replaced them with heroic statues. This cult of the great lie created a generation of citizens who lived in a fictional world, unable to recognize the rot of their own reality, because their textbooks had told them they were living in the greatest civilization in human history. The role of the pioneer organization and the militarization of childhood showed the terrifying efficiency of state-mandated social engineering. In the US, youth organizations like the Scouts were voluntary, community-based groups focused on outdoorsmanship, civic duty, and individual skills, offering a space for kids to grow outside the direct control of the federal government. In the USSR, the pioneers were a mandatory indoctrination camp in red ties. Every child was forced to join a rigid paramilitary hierarchy where their leisure time, their friendships, and even their secrets were monitored by the state. The pioneer lineup was a ritual of submission where children were taught to report on their parents, recite ideological oaths, and view their lives through the lens of class struggle. This was a theft of childhood innocence, turning a 10-year-old into a political agent for a regime that demanded total loyalty from the cradle to the grave. A difference that made the American child a dreamer and the Soviet child a miniature soldier of the bureaucracy. The contrast in civil defense and the cult of fear turned the school into a psychological bunker. In the US during the height of the Cold War, duck and cover drills were a response to a real threat. But they were quickly criticized and phased out as the culture shifted toward peace and de-escalation. The American school sought to protect the child from the fear of the bomb. In the USSR, fear was a mandatory subject in the curriculum, with initial military training, NVP, forcing teenagers to assemble Kalashnikovs in seconds and spend their lunch breaks in stifling rubber gas masks during Civil Defense Day. This wasn't just about safety. It was about normalizing the apocalypse, teaching children that the imperialist enemy was waiting to strike at any moment, creating a permanent state of paranoia that made the population easier to control. The American student was learning to build a better world. The Soviet student was being conditioned to survive a world that the party was ready to burn, a difference in psychological health that left the Soviet people with a permanent, deep-seated anxiety that defined their entire existence. The final contrast in this first part is the freedom of the library versus the locked archives, which determined who had access to the tools of liberation. In the US, the school library was a gateway to the world, providing access to any book, any idea, and any philosophy that the student was curious enough to seek out, a system where censorship was a scandal and curiosity was a virtue. The American system understood that a well-read citizen is the greatest defense against tyranny. In the USSR, the library was a prison for forbidden thoughts, where Spetskran, special collections, kept the great works of Western literature, philosophy, and even Soviet dissidents under lock and key, accessible only to those with high-level party clearance. Soviet children were fed a diet of approved socialist realism that glorified the tractor and the factory, while the works that could have truly expanded their minds were treated as radioactive contraband, a difference that meant the American student was armed with the knowledge of the world, while the Soviet student was trapped in an intellectual dark room, fed only the images the state allowed them to see. The destruction of the self began in the classroom, where the Soviet state waged a relentless war against any sign of individual deviation, a process of psychological leveling that was designed to make every child feel like a small, replaceable screw in a gargantuan machine. In the United States, the 1980s school system celebrated the outlier, the rebel, and the original thinker, encouraging students to find their unique voice through elective classes, art, and debate. The American classroom was a noisy, messy celebration of the individual, where the teacher's role was to unlock the specific genius of each child. In the USSR, individuality was treated as a disease, a bourgeois infection that had to be cured through collective shaming and rigid discipline if a student stood out. Whether through their clothing, their hair, or their ideas, they weren't praised. They were brought before the collective to be criticized and corrected. This institutionalized bullying was the state's way of ensuring that no one felt superior to the group, creating a society of people who were terrified of being noticed, a difference that turned the American school into a launchpad for dreams and the Soviet school into a compactor for the soul. The contrast in school uniforms and the erasure of identity revealed how the state used physical appearance to control the mind. In the U.S., while some private schools had uniforms, the public school system was a vibrant tapestry of self-expression, where what you wore was a declaration of who you were. From rock band t-shirts to the latest fashion trends, a visual manifestation of the freedom to choose your own identity. In the USSR, the uniform was a straitjacket, a scratchy brown wool dress for girls, and a rigid dark blue suit for boys that had to be worn exactly as prescribed, with no jewelry, no makeup, and no long hair allowed. Any attempt to customize the uniform, a shorter skirt or a different ribbon, was met with public humiliation and a moral lecture from the administration. This wasn't about neatness. It was about visual submission, teaching the child from the age of 7 that their body was public property and that the state had the right to dictate every detail of their existence, a physical training for a life of total conformity. The role of the wall newspaper and the culture of denunciation showed how the state turned children into ideological snitches. In the U.S., the school newspaper was a place for student journalism, satire, and the questioning of school policies, a training ground for a free press where young writers learned the power of the written word to effect change. In the USSR, the Stengazeta, wall newspaper, was often a tool of public execution, a place where lazy students or those with un-Soviet behavior were mocked with cruel caricatures and their names listed for everyone to see. Children were encouraged to help their comrades by reporting their political errors or their secret listening to Western radio stations to the teachers. This normalization of betrayal broke the trust between friends and even within families, creating a society where everyone was watching everyone else. a difference that turned the American student into a citizen and the Soviet student into a voluntary informant for the system. The contrast in The Cult of the Teacher versus The Authority of the Party redefined the relationship between wisdom and power. In the U.S., the teacher was a professional, often a mentor, whose authority was based on their knowledge and their ability to inspire, a relationship that encouraged a healthy skepticism of power and a respect for expertise. In the USSR, the teacher was a low-level commissar, a person whose primary job was to relay the latest party directives and ensure that the ideological purity of the students remained intact. The teacher didn't have to be right. They only had to be aligned with the general line. And a student who pointed out a logical flaw in a political lesson wasn't smart. They were dangerous. This extinction of intellectual honesty turned the classroom into a theater of the absurd, where both the teacher and the student knew they were lying, but both were too afraid to be the first to stop. A difference that made the American classroom a place of learning and the Soviet classroom a place of performance. The final contrast in this part is the war on foreign influence and the fear of a pop song, which showed the fragility of the Soviet mind control machine. In the US, the 1980s were a time of global fusion, where cultural influences from around the world, from British New Wave to Japanese tech, were embraced and integrated into the American identity, creating a culture that was strong because it was open. In the USSR, a Michael Jackson poster was a security threat, and a cassette tape of The Beatles was treated like an illegal weapon. School administrators conducted raids on student lockers to find forbidden Western symbols, and lectures were held on the moral decay of disco and rock and roll. This cultural paranoia revealed the truth, that the Soviet state knew its ideology was too weak to survive a single catchy pop melody, a difference that meant the American system grew by absorbing the world, while the Soviet system shrank by fearing it, building a wall of isolation that only made the forbidden fruit of the West taste sweeter to every child who managed to get a bite. The transition from school to the university was not a step toward intellectual freedom, but a deeper descent into the state's ideological machinery, where the stakes were higher and the surveillance more sophisticated. In the United States, the university was a marketplace of ideas, a place of radical experimentation where students could protest their own government, explore niche philosophies, and develop the specialized skills that drove the global economy. The American campus was a cradle of innovation and dissent, where the friction of different viewpoints sparked the fires of progress. In the USSR, the university was a filter for the elite, where academic excellence was secondary to socialist reliability. If you weren't a member of the Komsomol, Young Communist League, and didn't have a clean political record, the doors to higher education were slammed in your face. Regardless of your IQ, this ideological gatekeeping ensured that the brightest minds were often excluded in favor of the most obedient ones, a difference that made the American university an engine of growth and the Soviet university a sorting office for the bureaucracy. The contrast in scientific communism versus academic inquiry revealed the intellectual rot at the heart of the Soviet system. In the US, students were required to take a broad range of liberal arts classes that encouraged them to compare different economic and political models, fostering a well-rounded and skeptical worldview that valued evidence over dogma. In the USSR, scientific communism was a mandatory tumor in every degree. Whether you were studying to be a concert pianist, a nuclear physicist, or a brain surgeon, you were forced to spend hundreds of hours memorizing the dry, nonsensical slogans of Marx and Lenin and passing exams on the inevitable collapse of capitalism. This theft of intellectual time wasn't just a nuisance. It was a psychological tax that drained the creative energy of the nation's youth, forcing them to perform mental gymnastics to justify a system that they could see was failing in real time, a difference that turned American students into thinkers and Soviet students into cynical actors who memorized lies to get a diploma. The role of the mandatory placement, распределение, and the death of ambition showed how the state owned not just your education, but your entire future. In the U.S., the transition to the workforce was a time of intense competition and personal choice. The American dream allowed a graduate to move to any city, join any company, or start their own business, creating a liquid and dynamic labor market that rewarded talent and mobility. In the USSR, you were a serf of the Ministry of Education. Upon graduation, you were distributed by the state to a specific job in a specific city, often a remote village or a decaying industrial plant. Where you were legally required to work for 3 years, your personal life, your family, and your desires were irrelevant. You were a piece of human equipment being moved across a map by a faceless bureaucrat. This distribution system killed the very spirit of excellence, as students knew that no matter how hard they worked, their fate was already sealed by a state that viewed them as a statistical unit rather than a human being. The contrast in student life and the culture of silence turned the university years from a time of exploration into a time of caution. In the U.S., the 1980s campus was a hub of identity politics, student newspapers, and open debate on everything from the Cold War to environmentalism, a world where loudness was a sign of health. In the USSR, the university dorm was a place of whispers and stukachi, informants. Every student group was infiltrated by KGB curators or Komsomol activists who reported on anti-Soviet conversations or the possession of samizdat, underground literature. The fear of being expelled for political unreliability was a constant shadow that hung over every cafeteria conversation and every late-night party. This institutionalized paranoia turned a generation of intellectuals into masters of Aesopian language, a way of speaking in metaphors and codes to avoid the secret police, a difference that made the American student a participant in his society and the Soviet student a fugitive in his own classroom. The final contrast in this part is the brain drain versus the brain prison, which determined who would lead the technological race of the 21st century. In the U.S., the university system was a global magnet, attracting the most brilliant minds from every continent with the promise of freedom, resources, and the right to own their own discoveries, creating a virtuous cycle of intellectual wealth. In the USSR, the most brilliant scientists were often kept in sharashkas, scientific prison labs, or forbidden from traveling abroad for fear they would defect to the West. The state treated intelligence as a state secret to be guarded rather than a flame to be fanned. This paralysis of the mind meant that while individual Soviet scientists were geniuses, the system they worked in was a suffocating cage that prevented their ideas from ever reaching the people, a difference that proved a society can only be as smart as it is free, and the Soviet Union, in its obsession with controlling the brain, had only succeeded in suffocating its own future. The ultimate failure of Soviet education was the creation of a generation that mastered the art of doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs at once, reciting party slogans in public while harboring total contempt for the system in private. In the United States, the educational model was self-correcting, as the 1980s saw a massive investment in computer literacy and critical analysis that prepared American youth for the digital revolution. The American system didn't need to force loyalty. It earned it by providing the tools for personal success, proving that a society of free thinkers is inherently more stable than a society of forced believers. In the USSR, the state's obsession with ideological purity had created an intellectual vacuum, as the brightest young minds realized that their education was a trap designed to keep them subservient rather than to make them brilliant. This psychological divorce between the people and the state was the true beginning of the end, as the Soviet new man turned out to be a cynical survivor who was ready to trade his red tie for a pair of jeans the moment the border cracked open. The contrast in the power of the truth versus the fragility of the lie reached its breaking point during the era of glasnost, when the Iron Curtain of information began to melt in the U.S. The constant exposure to different viewpoints and the presence of a free press acted like a vaccine, making the population resilient to propaganda because they were used to filtering through a sea of competing ideas. In the USSR, the truth acted like a lethal radiation because the state had kept its people in an artificial, sterile environment for 70 years. The sudden exposure to the reality of the Gulag, the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the true economic success of the West acted like a biological shock. The Soviet school had taught them what to think, but it had never taught them how to process a lie of such massive proportions, a difference that meant when the propaganda stopped, the entire foundation of the state vanished overnight, leaving an entire nation feeling like they had spent their lives in a Truman Show that had suddenly been turned off. The role of the red diploma and the worthlessness of Soviet pedagogy showed that a degree based on ideology is a currency that has no value in a free world. In the US, the 1980s saw the rise of the knowledge economy, where a university degree was a passport to global opportunities, a credential recognized for its rigor and its focus on practical, innovative skills. In the USSR, the red diploma was often a certificate of conformity, a document that proved you could memorize the works of Lenin, but didn't necessarily mean you could design a microchip or manage a modern business. When the USSR collapsed, millions of highly educated specialists found themselves intellectually bankrupt as their years of study in scientific communism and political economy were revealed to be useless in a market-driven reality. This was the final betrayal of the Soviet student, a realization that the state had stolen their youth to teach them a language that no one else in the world spoke. The contrast in the legacy of education and the future of democracy continues to play out in the halls of power today. In the US, the tradition of liberal education, the study of ethics, logic, and rhetoric, remains a cornerstone of the democratic process, ensuring that even in times of crisis, there is a core of the population that values the individual over the state, a legacy of the Enlightenment that has survived for over 2 centuries in the former Soviet space. The ghost of the pioneer lineup still haunts the political culture, as the habit of submission and the fear of the collective make the transition to true democracy a painful, multi-generational struggle. This deep state of the mind is the most difficult thing to decontaminate, as the Soviet system didn't just build factories, it built a specific type of consciousness that is still fighting against the light of freedom in many parts of Eurasia today. The final verdict on the educational Cold War is that you can build a superpower on the obedience of the many, but you can only sustain a civilization on the creativity of the individual. The United States won because it understood that a teacher's greatest job is to be the first person a student disagrees with, a philosophy that turned every classroom into a factory of the future. The Soviet Union failed because it tried to turn the mind into a fortress, and in doing so, it created a prison for its own potential. Its collapse was the moment the world realized that a gas mask is not a substitute for a textbook, and a red tie is not a substitute for a free heart. The American student was taught to reach for the stars. The Soviet student was taught to look at the ground, and the end of the Cold War was the moment the ground finally gave way, proving that the most powerful weapon in human history is not the nuclear missile, but the child who is allowed to ask, why? What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital, or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.